A 47-year-old gentleman died in the United States, specifically in New Jersey, after eating red meat. This may be a case that you know nothing about, or even a condition that you've never heard of, called alpha gal syndrome, red meat allergy. This is exploding since COVID in 2020. I'm here to try and tie the science together with the trajectory changes that are happening. This is essentially what I tend to focus on. I look at anything that changes and I want to have an explanation as to why. And when we look at the data, this is what is happening. This is from a paper that was published in 2025, looking at the incidence of alpha gal syndrome. And you can see down here from 2013, 2014, a gradual rise, a quicker rise in 2019, 2020, a change in 21, 22, and an explosion in 2023, 24. This is a 100% rise in this pattern tied to this tick bite. What's going on? Why do I think that it could be relevant with regards to COVID? That's where I'm going to tie the science together with exactly what is likely to be happening. So stay with me. This insight that I had just today, because this is not a condition that I normally look at, I just thought any change, let me see if I can understand the mechanisms. And what I've discovered today is helping me to understand many of the patterns that people are suffering from. So many people have ongoing symptoms, doesn't make sense. When you go through what this disease is about and you extrapolate it to other conditions, you will realize why this is so relevant. So let's start with some basic science. Firstly, what do we mean by alpha gal? So this is a small sugar tag which can be on a protein in mammalian cells, usually animal protein or fat, one or the other. And then it has this little glycan, which is galactose alpha 1,3 galactose. It's just what the body tends to do to tag and identify specific things. So this small molecule seems to be able to trigger immune responses. Now, the description here is just like it's like a small flower on a tree. That's the size or the relevance of this alpha gal. But it is found on beef, pork, lamb, and venison, and not really on fish, chickens, and humans don't have it. And so, this is one of the things you'll be hearing about with regards to the fact that there is a change with the CO2 and climate change, that they want us to eat less red meat. And some people have aligned this pattern to the fact that it is related to increased risk of people being exposed to ticks. So there are boxes found everywhere, and this may be the rise. It's possible, but I suspect that this is something else. So let's go through with this. So the next thing is that ticks can normally cause many diseases, and in the U.S. you have a number of different ones. The black-legged deer tick can cause Lyme disease. This one is very important and almost similar in terms of the kind of pathology that it can cause. Again, on the West Coast, Lyme disease by the western black-legged tick. Then this is the relevant tick, the Lone Star tick, Southwest, East, Midwest, the United States. This one can trigger alpha gal syndrome. You have the American dog tick, which can do Rocky Mountain spotted fever and tularemia, and a similar thing in the Colorado region. And so these ticks are already in existence, and people can get bitten by them. And depending on their immune response, this can then lead to different kinds of pathology. So the premise is this tag exists on mammalian meat, okay? Beef, pork, lamb, and it's there normally. It doesn't cause any problems. But here's the sequence that can happen. Someone then gets bitten by a tick. Within the tick saliva, there is something that is similar to alpha gal. And normally your immune system will respond to the tick saliva. This is why you'll get a wheal or a bump and a little bit of itching after you've been bitten. And this then can trigger the immune system to come primed for exposure subsequently to alpha gal. And this is where now mast cells become sensitized with IgE antibodies. Means is that if you are exposed again, you can produce IgE, which triggers mast cells to become sensitized and release their contents and cause an allergic response. So in this case, we're talking about an allergen, this alpha gal glycan becoming triggered by your immune system. It's kind of like you had penicillin, your immune system reacted to it, produced an IgE. The first time you get it, it doesn't really cause a response. The second time you get a response, the third time it could be anaphylaxis. And so in this case, it seems as though there is some degree of priming of the immune system here. Once that has occurred, it means potentially other tick bites as well as any exposure to alpha gal could trigger an immune response. And so this is the basis that we're going from. Now, let's look carefully at this very unusual case. And this, I must explain, is the severe end of the spectrum. But the principles still apply in terms of how disease presents. This is a fatal anaphylactic reaction 4 hours after eating beef in a young man with IgE antibodies, and this is alpha gal, galactose alpha 1,3 galactose, that little tag that's on either fat or protein in animal meat. Here is where the priming occurred. In summer of 2024, he was 47 years old, an airline pilot, no past medical history, went on a camping trip. He then ate supper at 10, which included beef, which was unusual because they normally ate chicken. At 2 a.m., he had abdominal discomfort, which was very severe. He was writhing in pain. He had diarrhea and vomiting. 2 hours later, it settled. He went back to sleep. And he was able to then walk even 5 miles. And he had breakfast. And he thought, okay, this may just be one of those episodes. Now, this episode indicates that this was the first exposure after being primed. And when you go back, it's important here later on, it points out that his wife replied that he had been bitten by ticks, about 12 to 13 bites around the ankles, chiggers, they call them. That would have been the Lone Star chick. That had happened previously, a few years before, but none that year. So this would have been the priming episode. This episode here would have been the first exposure. And then what we come to is the more serious episode, which led to an anaphylactic reaction. Now, it's important to understand this is not common. But the point is that if it can occur with an anaphylactic reaction, I look for spectrum of disease. So meaning if at one end of the spectrum it's severe, the question is when it's not so severe, what does the clinical presentation look like? So let's go back to this case because this then gives us the framework to understand. 2 weeks later in New Jersey, he went to a barbecue where he ate a hamburger at 3 p.m. Now, the timing is important. If we go back here, at 10 p.m., he ate the beef. At 2 a.m., he had the symptoms. That's 4 hours. And that time frame is very important. In this case, he ate the hamburger at 3 p.m. He went home. He was fine. He mowed the lawn for an hour. He was fine. He had no symptoms when his wife left at 7 p.m. Then at 7:20, he went to the bathroom and his son was saying to his mother, Dad is getting sick again. So again, you notice 3 p.m., to 7:30 p.m., 7:20, about 4 hours. 4 hours here, 4 hours here. Now, that time frame is important because if I inject penicillin in you and you're allergic, your reaction could be in minutes, that anaphylactic. If you know someone who has a nut allergy, it is absolutely rapid sometimes. So the time delay becomes very relevant for what I would be explaining is my hypothesis as to what is happening and critically why I think this is happening more often. So he then ended up calling 911, which is the emergency call out in the US, and by 7:37 p.m. he was unconscious, needed resuscitation, and very sadly, after 2 hours, they were unable to resuscitate him. He was pronounced dead at 10:20 p.m. So this is a very sad case, but an extreme case. And it's important to remember the family and how traumatized they would be by this. And hopefully the lessons learned from this case will protect other people through looking at the science. So the question is then, and this is now comes to an important part, is that he was then taken to hospital. They did all the investigations. They found nothing. So they did microscopic examination of his heart, the lung, liver. They did toxicology screens, small amount of alcohol. He had DPH, antihistamine in his system. And the conclusion was sudden death, unexplained death. Now, this is what is happening a lot of times to many people and families. In this case, his wife wanted to know why her husband had died, and she continued to investigate and asked for a second opinion on the autopsy report. Now, listen, this is so important, and this is something that I say to people because we have such few autopsies being done since the pandemic. Not since the pandemic, we had loads of autopsies in the early phase of the pandemic, but we have had very few autopsies, especially when we're looking at vaccinated cohorts. And that has blinded a lot of the research to understand pathology that happens afterwards. It seems I'm one of the few people who asks about this, but luckily, this wife was not satisfied with just simple, sudden, unexplained death. She wanted more answers. And more people need to become like this. You need to ask the questions and force the medical and scientific community to come up with answers because we need answers. We need autopsies. We need solutions. So when this was done, he then repeated some blood tests looking at a range of allergens. There was some to ryegrass and ragweed, and the IgE was low. But that's when they found that the IgE to alpha gal was more elevated, and it was about 3.4% of his total IgE. They did a further test in the Mayo Clinic lab, which found his tryptase levels were over 2,000. Now, tryptase is usually produced by mast cells. And so in this case, with such a high level, that's in keeping with the highest values reported from cases of fatal anaphylaxis. So what we know is that he had an anaphylactic response at the time, and this was most likely the cause of death, not just sudden unexplained death. Now, this is really important because this occurred 4 hours after eating protein, in this case hamburger. He then had a severe response to that. Now, I'm going to take you through my hypothesis as to what I think happened. So follow along. Remember the 4-hour timeline. And so we'll take you through step by step. When things are being absorbed in the intestines, I suspect that in his case, the alpha gal was put on fat and it was absorbed from fat. Now, many people don't realize this, but when fat goes into the intestine, it is not absorbed directly into the bloodstream. it's packaged into these things we call chylomicrons. These then are put into the lymphatic system. So it bypasses initially the bloodstream. So these lymphatics will then take all of these chylomicron labeled alpha gal. So this is my hypothesis, to the lymph nodes. At the lymph nodes, if there is sensitization, it could then trigger an immune response. Okay? So that's the essence of what I'll be talking about here. And I'm going to take it through. Let's go again because you need to understand this sequence here to make sense of it. So we'll come back to that image, but look again and let's break it down. This is the meat, protein, and fat. Let's say in this situation, the hamburger, the alpha gal tag is attached to the fat. Proteins are usually broken down into smaller pieces in the stomach, but fats pass through the stomach, go into the small intestines where they are attached to bile, or the bile helps to put them into micelles, little clumps all together, and then this is then absorbed through the lining. So you can see these clumps of fat are taken up. This is what we call a chylomicron. This would be inside an enterocyte, a cell in the intestine, packages it up nicely, and then it puts it into the lymphatic system. The lymphatic system will then carry and do the immune checks because everything in the body has to be checked to make sure that it's okay. So once it has passed through or is going through this lymphatic channel, this is what it would tend to look like. Now, here I've got an image of a loop of intestine. And it's interesting to note that almost all the intestine is held in a mesentery. It's like wrapped around the intestine on the outside. And then this fat pad, so large fat pad inside holding all the intestines together, are all the lymph nodes. So you would then find that these chylomicrons, and in my situation, saying the tag, alpha tag, is then on this, floating along up through the lymphatics until it hits the lymph nodes. When it hits the lymph nodes, that's where the immune system, especially the mast cells, will be doing its checks. And if there is immune priming, you can then have an immune response with regards to triggering release of histamine. And that can be absolutely huge. And in his case, over 2,000, this was a massive response. And so it suggests that when you look at the amount of lymphatics that you have, this is kind of like a picture of what your whole intestine would look like, small and large intestine, with all the mesentery. It's like a huge tree of lymph nodes. And you can imagine he's absorbing at multiple points. These are all going to multiple lymph nodes. And then these triggers are occurring all through and sending it all through the root into the bloodstream. So this mesentery, we actually think this is like a whole organ in itself. It does multiple functions. I was going to talk about it in relation to Crohn's disease, but it is a remarkable tissue that does a lot of the checking of fat to make sure that it is done. It is checked properly and the immune system and the body is protected. So in this case, I am indicating that this alpha-gal system will then trigger the anaphylaxis. And so here is the overview. You have here alpha-gal on the meat. I would say it's on the fat. It's just there. It's always there. This person has been primed before. So when the alpha-gal in the chylomicrons reaches to the lymph nodes that are already primed with IgE, you then have this trigger response where a massive release of histamine, tryptase, and other mediators triggers an anaphylactic response. Depending on where it is, you can get itching and swelling of the mouth. You can get wheezing, low blood pressure. In his case, he got abdominal pain, vomiting, diarrhea, and then his blood pressure crashed. So this was more likely the response, which very much suggests an intestinal trigger as the primary factor. Now, this is important to me because I have been looking at these patterns for a long time. And I have been explaining to people, do not underestimate what is happening in your intestines, in your gut. Don't accept ongoing symptoms because post COVID, this is likely to represent quite a significant immune trigger point. When we were doing our paper, and this is why it's of such interest to me, in our paper, this is the image from it, this paper, the central role of macrophages in long COVID pathophysiology. What we've said is that in the middle here is the macrophage activated with spike protein stuck in it. It tends to be driven by an inflamed intestine, triggering these macrophages, which are in the gut, in the immune system, in the mesenteric system. They can cause microclots, it can cause brain fog, they can trigger autoantibodies, and this is just going on and on. Critically, they can become amplified by mast cells, just as we spoke about before. So, my suspicion is that you have a situation where you have activated immune cells, which are already to some degree triggering mast cells. And when you have an amplification event, this explodes. And this is what I suspect would be happening. It's difficult to, at the moment, I'm speculating because I don't have all of his medical history. But if I was talking to him beforehand, I would bet I would find GI symptoms, gastrointestinal symptoms that were present with him that he thought was mild, no big deal. And that, in my view, represents that trigger and that primer for ongoing symptoms because he had an extreme case which led to anaphylaxis, which is extremely rare. But if you take it along the spectrum where a lot of people, after eating, 4, 6 hours after, they end up with gastrointestinal symptoms which don't make sense, I am starting to think that this is potentially related to that kind of immune response. So here, again, is my thought. A gut that is already inflamed with spike protein, spike primed macrophages from the mate cells, they then add another trigger to it, alpha gal, tick bite. Now, suddenly, this whole system is even more primed. So the person then is eating meat, red meat, fat. This then goes through the immune check, going the chylomicrons into the lymphatics, into the lymph nodes, and suddenly they have a massive IgE response because their immune system was already primed with spike and they would have had a previous tick bite. This then leads to a whole flare up of things, autoantibodies, microclots, more brain fog. So these people will have symptoms like abdominal pain, diarrhea, flushing, dizziness, maybe hives, and they think that this is just a mast cell problem. Very often you'll find they will take antihistamines. It dampens down the system's symptoms but doesn't resolve it. Fundamentally, their disease is here. Spike primed macrophages, they are stuck in there. We know from the research this is up to, oh gosh, it's up to now 740 days, I think. It just gets stuck in the immune system. And if you don't get it out, it's kind of like, I would say, a splinter in your hand, if you've ever had that experience, or a tiny wood piece of wood that's stuck in your finger. If you don't get it out, if you don't dig it out, it then just drives an inflammatory process. You feel uncomfortable long term and you have to get rid of it. This is an important phase. And I think that if you're interested in that, look in the description. There is a link to Spike Reset, a whole full length approach. Those people who are interested, and if they're in the UK, I think there is going to be access to a free supporting thing. I can't say what it is, just because of advertising information. The point being is there is something that could help. If you're in the UK, please just make sure you register, and I'll be able to send a link for you to be able to look at that. There are some free samples available. But the principle seems to be that this process is ongoing and it drives a whole series of mechanisms that leads to these patterns of diseases. Just a quick summary overview here. This is what I'm proposing. Alpha gal on fat in animal protein gets taken up in the small intestine in an already primed individual, goes along the mesenteric lymphatics, hits the lymph nodes, which have primed mast cells. As soon as they see alpha gal, they explode. They produce huge amounts of histamine, tryptase, causing symptoms, and this could lead to quite significant responses. And so when we think about it that way, suddenly the data makes sense. And this is why I said at the beginning, I predict that this trajectory is going to continue to rise. And if we don't come up with solutions, people are going to think it's just about the ticks. My instinct is that the ticks are part of the problem and they are spreading, and that has to be addressed. But if this is happening in an immune system, a gut immune system that is already primed, that could therefore be the disaster that we would want to avoid. This case is quite sad, and I have here the Mayo Lab report. This was at the time, and it shows his tryptase result was over 2,000. That's one of the highest it can be. This is definitely a histamine response. And one of the sad parts is that if this was known, if you've come across any kind of cardiac arrests, in this case, because he would have had no rash, no known allergies, the resuscitating team would not have been aware that potentially antihistamines, adrenaline, antihistamines at that time may have been life-saving, depending on the time frame that they would have seen him. When you look carefully at the history and the fact that this point here, he collapsed by 7:37 p.m., initiated resuscitation. I'm not sure if they would have even realized that this could have been an essentially an anaphylactic response, because there would have been no other symptoms around that would have indicated that. And so very importantly, people need to be aware of this so that if these things occur and there is a timeline and a trajectory, it is so valuable to the medical team, because they'd have nothing to lose at that point. If family knew this and they said, listen, they've had some responses like this could be an anaphylaxis, why don't you try some antihistamines? There is rarely nothing to lose. It's unlikely to cause any more risk to the patient, especially if they're not responding to standard resuscitation measures. And they went on for 2 hours here. So this was definitely a sad case, a 47-year-old pilot. We all learn from these cases. And as I said, it has taught me an important thing with regards to mesenteric inflammation as a potential contributor to some of the patterns that we are seeing happening across the board, across the population. So if you are having gut symptoms that are just ongoing, don't tolerate it, please. I have already seen hundreds of responses. There are so many people who have been having these symptoms for over 12 months. You need to do something about it. Follow along, and I'll be trying to give you some ideas as to how we can find ways forward. Have a great evening.